Today, we have all the latest news in the palms of our hands. Our mobile devices allow us to watch events unfold a whole continent away, live and in real time. Through alerts in our individually curated news sources, the important elements of the event are isolated and framed for us just seconds after the journalist covering it hits send. By the time the 11 o'clock news rolls around, we've heard the broad details of that day's story a few times, and then we're looking for deeper context and analysis. And much of what we see and hear in mainstream media is still provided by bureaus and freelancers and stringers who are all over the world. And they write for various press agencies, ones like Reuters or the Canadian Press, or the American Press, AP, which is one of the world's oldest and most robust news gathering organizations. Today, it has reporters all over the globe, and much of the information that you read on your device probably comes from AP. There's technology, there's tools, and they can bring things to you right away. But 175 years ago, it was a lot more complicated. It involved transatlantic crossings and news boats, tin cans and carrier pigeons. And as always, there was a Cape Bretoner right in the middle of it. His name was Jack Murphy. We're going to talk about him in just a moment. Theresa O'Leary heard the fragments of this story as a little girl, and she worked her career as a journalist with the CBC, and she picked away at those details for years. And now she has a delightful history called Race to the Cape, the daring news chase, the birth of the Associated Press, and the journalist at the heart of it all. We had a chance to speak with her about her book. Here's our conversation. Good afternoon, Theresa. Welcome to Mainstreet.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
This story starts with a small nugget of family lore. What was that?
Well, it's interesting. My dad always told me this story as a kid growing up. He would say, "Oh, the AP had a news boat at Cape Race, chasing after the news being thrown overboard by the steamship." And I was a kid, and I imagined that it was newspapers floating on the ocean. So it really made no sense to me for a long time. And I really thought maybe it's not true. But when I became a journalist in my early 20s with the CBC Radio News, I did some research, and that was pre-internet, so I had to go to Montreal and go deep into the archives. But I did, and I confirmed that it actually was true. The Associated Press, this newswire agency in New York City, had put this news boat, a rowboat with 5 guys in it, led by Captain Murphy, John Murphy, and they had put that boat at Cape Race because that was the first access to any news from England to Europe at the time, because there was no transatlantic telegraph cable at that time.
So help me with the geography of this, because you would think that, all things remaining equal, that Halifax would have been the place at the very least. But I'm not even sure I understand how the news is getting overboard and into the boat and out to newspapers all over. Can you just draw that out for me?
Sure, for sure. And like Halifax was an important place, but it wasn't the most easterly point in North America. In Cape Race is very close to the most easterly point in North America because it's in Newfoundland on the southeast tip of the province. And so as ships left England, they would chart their course actually for Newfoundland because you had to pass Newfoundland in order to go down the eastern seaboard to New York and Boston, or even to go up Cabot Strait and into the St. Lawrence Seaway to Montreal and Quebec City. And so that was kind of the route. And my dad always said as well when he was telling me that story that Cape Race is first landfall in North America. And what that means is that really it is the first place that most ships coming to the New World back then, and even today, but back then for sure, that was the first sight of land that they had when they came through the fog at Cape Race, Newfoundland. But Halifax was an important key point as well because the Associated Press put their first foreign correspondent at Halifax. And that guy was a name named Daniel H. Craig.
And Craig decides that information is important. That's one of the things. But he's also really motivated by accuracy. And in the 1850s, I'm wondering to what extent that was a general concern about the information that people were getting.
Right, that's a really good question because before the telegraph was launched in 1844, the only media we had in the world were newspapers. And so in New York City, there were a whole bunch of newspapers, but there were half a dozen that were the key ones. And they came together because of the Mexican War in 1846, 2 years after the telegraph was launched. The telegraph fees were very expensive because as new technologies come in, it's always that way. So the newspaper owners in New York City, the newspapers were owned by rich, powerful men with political opinions. So there really wasn't objective news in the way we view it today. But the Associated Press was key to creating this new modern journalism, basically, the new principles of modern journalism. Because when the Associated Press, let me start again. The Associated Press was formed because these six newspapers didn't want to pay the expensive fees of the telegraph to get news from the Mexican war front in 1846. And so they came together, and to save money, they decided, let's just get one report from the Mexican war front instead of all of us spending a fortune on pony expresses and telegraph fees to get the news north to New York City. And so when they came together and asked for one report, it meant it had to be fact-based. It couldn't be opinionated because there were six opinionated masters of the Associated Press at this point. And this was a very loose coalition of these newspaper owners. They weren't coming together permanently yet. But 2 years later, they decided they had to come together and form the Associated Press, basically to handle the telegraph news. Because like the internet, there was just garbage going on the telegraph at that time. And in response to the fake news that was going on the telegraph back in the day, this was part of what provoked the change in journalism.
Now, it's interesting because when you talk about those six newspapers, presumably some of them would have been the modern equivalent of left-leaning, and some would have been the modern equivalent of right-leaning, and some would have been the modern equivalent of centrist. So objective, fact-based news means that it can appear in any newspaper and not offend the readership.
Exactly. You've got it exactly right. And so it was very interesting that this happened kind of organically because of the new technology, Organically, these guys came together to save money. They didn't have a vision, actually, for an expanded news organization. That was Daniel Craig, who once the AP formed, and he was unbeatable. He was in Boston, and he was chasing after the news from those steamships that were arriving in Boston, and he would go in rowboats with carrier pigeons, get on those steamships, get the latest news, send it to shore with his wife, who would then take the news to the telegraph station and telegraph it to New York City. And so Daniel Craig was a key person in transforming things because definitely the Associated Press, when it came together initially, it sort of provoked this nonpartisan or neutral or impartial voice in journalism, right? Because as you say, there would be just too much competition and disagreement between all the opinionated newspapers. And so Daniel Craig took that basic idea, and he had been chasing the news himself. There's a great chapter in the book that has a scene in which the AP in New York City hires a boat to go from Boston up to Halifax to get the latest news coming into Halifax on the steamships, okay? Daniel Craig was in Boston, and he wanted to beat the AP. So he would go up on that boat, and he would do his research, find out everything going on in England and Europe. Then he would hide out on the AP boat, the Buena Vista, and he would go south to Boston with his carrier pigeons. And then as soon as the Massachusetts coastline came into view, he would send off his pigeon posts, right? And the Associated Press in New York City at this point, they were totally upset with him because he was always beating them. And so in the end, actually, they hired him to be the first foreign correspondent of the AP in Halifax.
Now, let's go back to our Cape Bretoner, who is the captain of this news boat that's rowing out into the North Atlantic somewhere and picking off barrels that are coming into the water, and somehow there's news on that. Who's he, and who's sending the barrels, and all of these questions.
Okay. So the guy who the Associated Press hired to man their rowboat or their news boat, it was a 4-man crew plus the captain. Captain John Murphy from Cape Breton was given that job. And he is recorded in Newfoundland's history books with one line. And the one line was, "No one can imagine the daring it took for Captain Murphy and his crew to chase after those news canisters in the Atlantic." And that's all that people in Newfoundland know about this story, because that's all that we had been recorded. But anyway, Captain Murphy, he was an incredible guy, because he not only did that, chasing after those news canisters, that basically all the steamships, well, not all of them, but the main steamships companies had lucrative mail contracts with the government of England and with private companies. But the government of England was the big contract. And they were sending over lots of correspondence all the time, So that's who was sending over the news, let's say. And the mail officers on board the ships would put these little bits of news, pieces of paper, into a little can, the size of a coffee can, actually. It had a little hook on it, a little rope on it, and a little flag. And the rope could be hooked with the cod jigging hook. And so that's how they would pull in these canisters. But they were actually green in color, and so they just floated around in the ocean until these guys were able to locate them. But I want to say about Captain Murphy, he was extraordinary, because he not only did that, before that, he helped build the network across Newfoundland of the telegraph. He was hired by the New York, Newfoundland, and London Telegraph Company, which was building the transatlantic telegraph across the Atlantic. And in order to connect Newfoundland with North America, they first had to connect Cabot Strait. Like over Cabot Strait, a cable was laid underneath there. Murphy was involved in that. He then was involved in basically clearing the land across Newfoundland from Port aux Basques to St. John's, almost 600 miles, and it was completely undeveloped. So they had to fell the trees, cut down the trees. Then they had to put up the poles. They had to clear the path, and then they had to train the local people in the telegraph skills. So Murphy did all of that, and then he was chosen to be this guy on the AP News boat at Cape Breton. Extraordinary guy. Unfortunately, I could not find out when he was born and exactly where he was born, but he definitely came from Cape Breton. My research has shown that. So I believe it's Sydney, but I don't want to say for sure.
So history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And I found myself thinking about how hard it is to get really good information as I was reading the book.
Right.
When you reflect on the lessons for today, what do you come to?
It's interesting, because I do find that people, as they're reading the book, they do make the comparison with today, because there's a lot of similarities. I mean, the telegraph was dubbed the Victorian internet for a reason. It had the same impact in that society as it did today. And so in the beginning, everybody was overwhelmed with this new technology, didn't quite know what to do with it. As I said, Daniel Craig, when he was hired by the AP finally in 1849 and went to New York City, within about a year, he became the general manager, because he could see that there was a possibility to expand journalism through this telegraph technology. The newspaper owners didn't have that vision. He's the guy that brought that vision to them, and he had to convince them to spend money to expand this journalistic enterprise, the AP. And one of the first things he did was he went on a tour of 14 cities in North America and the United States, and in the British, we were not Canada yet, so in the provinces. And when he went back, he told the AP board of directors that everywhere he went, the editors of the newspapers were just disgusted with what was moving on the telegraph. It was, some people would go on there and just read the Bible and be there like for days just reading the Bible. So there was like crazy stuff going on, just like in the internet today. We've seen such transformation of journalism. And the Telegraph transformed the journalism landscape then, and it's doing the same now. I think Daniel Craig, if he were here now, he would say to people like Rupert Murdoch and other, billionaires who own the media landscape now, it's like, stop thinking about your own pocketbook. Why don't you think about society? The internet offers incredible opportunity for expansion of the distribution of the news in many different avenues. So why are we shrinking the media landscape? Why are we shrinking all of our TV, our broadcasting networks, and the whole news system is being shrunk. Newspapers are going out of business. So I think that's what Daniel Craig would say today, is that stop thinking about your own little bottom line, Rupert Murdoch, and expand this journalistic enterprise on the internet in a way that actually benefits society. That's what I think he would say.
Well, Theresa, I really thank you for your book and sharing time with us today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk to you, Wendy.
And that's Theresa O'Leary, a former CBC News journalist, filmmaker, playwright, and the author of Race to the Cape, The Daring News Chase, the birth of the Associated Press and the journalist at the heart of it all.